Buenas tardes, bienvenidos.
Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you very much for being with us in this journey to the Arab world through Aula Universitaria in this third seminar of our cycle. We're going to go back to Palestine to talk about the United Nations and the issue of Palestine, about double standards and international law. And we're going to do that with a great guest, Mr. Ardi Imseis. Would you like the translation device? Professor of International Law at the Queen's University. It is an honor for him to have accepted to be here with us, to participate not just in today's conference, but in the other conferences that we have organized this week, this morning at the Complutense and Nebrija universities. On Wednesday, he's going to Casa Árabe Córdoba, and on Thursday, he'll go to Barcelona with the CERC and IMED as part of the Aula Mediterránea collaboration framework. He's also accepted to participate in a series of interviews with the media over the last few days. So thank you so much, Professor. It's a very important day today. Finally, there's been a release and exchange of hostages today, and they have started to implement the ceasefire summit in Egypt, and international law needs to be on the table, as the professor will tell us today. So thank you very much once again. He's an expert on the Palestinian issue in international law. He's a legal advisor for different organizations such as UN agencies, the Security Council, as well as being a lawyer for the International Court of Justice. So it's an honor to have you here. And in order to introduce you properly, we also have another great expert, in this case a national expert, Isaías Barreñada. He's a professor of international relations and co-director of the research group on Maghreb and the Middle East, and author of several publications on the Palestine issue. And he's also here representing the degree of international relations at the Complutense University, with whom we organize this session. So thank you very much, Isaías, for your collaboration with Aula Árabe Universitaria, and especially for being able to come into this conference and for inviting Mr. Ardi Imseis. Before I give you the floor, allow me to remind you about a couple of things regarding the Aula Árabe Universitaria. We organize a cycle of conferences in cooperation with other universities, mainly in the Madrid and Cordoba, where we have our two headquarters, but also in nearby cities. And this year we do it with the support of the new regional cooperation program with the Arab world, Masaralan, of the Spanish Agency for International Cooperation and Development. And as you know, the objective of AAU, as in any other journey, is to bring closer to us the different realities that we find in the Arab countries at all levels, and also to bring closer to us issues related to Arab countries. For the public, it's open to anyone, but also to the students of the university programs that participate in this group of conferences. So I would like to remind you, for those who are with us and who want to be with us throughout all the sessions, that at the end of the course, we will give you, as a proof of the experience that you have acquired, a certificate of the Aula Árabe Universitaria. Therefore, those who are in Madrid have to register their attendance by stamping the passport that we give you when you come into the session. They are right at the door. And for those who are online, such as from the Aula Mediterránea cycle with which we collaborate, you can certify your attendance in the online form that we have, and as you can see, this conference will be streamed. Thank you very much. Isaias, I give you the floor. And it also is in the YouTube channel. Thank you very much. Thank you to Casa Árabe once again for listening to the suggestions that we make from the universities, in this case from my university, the Complutense University in Madrid. It is a great opportunity to be able to have with us a great expert on international law who also knows deep down and from the practical terms, not just from theory, the involvement of the United Nations with Palestine. Ardi Imseis, a professor on international law at the Queen's University in Canada. He has a long experience working with institutions, with UN agencies, for instance, for 12 years. He was a member at the UNRWA for the Palestinian refugees. He's also been a legal advisor for different bodies. He's participated in research committees for instance, in Yemen. He's been also a legal advisor before the International Court of Justice. And however, he will be speaking only on his behalf. He will not be speaking on behalf of the organizations or bodies he has worked for. He's also written a book entitled United Nations and the Question of Palestine, which is one of the most interesting summaries of a very complex topic, because the United Nations has been involved in the question of Palestine since before 1948. I'm sure that in his speech he will mention that. But we hear before a contradiction. It is very common to hear that United Nations does nothing to solve the issue of Palestine. But when you actually know this in depth, if you know this question in depth, you realize it's the opposite. United Nations has used all the tools it has to solve the question of Palestine in the different bodies of the organization, all the bodies of the organization, the agencies, the special envoys, military missions. They have been involved in the question of Palestine. Maybe we should ask ourselves, what has the United Nations not done about Palestine? But the problems are others, rest somewhere else. What are the limits of an organization such as the United Nations as it was created? What are the mandates of the different bodies? What is the role of the states who are those responsible? The United Nations is not above the states. And the issue of Palestine, the question of Palestine, shows the need and the limits of a complex organization with such a long process that has transformed the UN of 1947 after the assembly in November is very different to the United Nations of today. The same concept of decolonization has changed with time. It's not even in the Charter of the United Nations. However, since the 60s, it became a key part of the work of the United Nations in order to solve this type of conflict. Therefore, I think that a talk such as the one that Mr. Imseis will give us is very important for us to understand the role of an organization such as the United Nations, but also to look into the matter of the question. Why does it work better in some cases than in others? Why is the international law championed with more conviction in some cases rather than in others? Why are there vetoes or blocks? Mr. Imseis has also been the editor and responsible of the Palestine Yearbook of International Law. He was the publisher for over 10 years. He has been involved in several publishing topics and projects, and I am sure that today's talk will be very interesting to us, and I'm sure it'll be very suggestive. Obviously, at the end of his speech, we can ask him questions, so do feel free and make the most of the time after his talk to have some debate. It's a pleasure. You have the floor, Mr. Imseis.
I should like to.
You need to sorry, you need to turn on the. Yeah.
Yes. Am I audible to you? That's good. I should like to thank you for such a wonderful introduction. Before I begin, I also want to thank the interpreters in that booth up there. That's not easy work, and you're doing a remarkable job of it. Gratitude is owed to the Casa Árabe, and in particular Miguel Aguilar, Olivia Orozco, and Isias Barañada for inviting me to address you today. Special thanks are owed to Ruth Toya for assisting me with media today, and my dear friend, Professor Sonia Bulos, for facilitating, indeed suggesting that I come to Spain for the week to give talks. So thank you. I should also like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the presence of a dear old friend of mine, Monica de la Guardia, who served with me, a Spaniard who lives in Madrid. She's here. She served with me with UNRWA as a legal advisor for many years. She's brilliant. You should all have a chance to talk to her afterwards if possible as well. I'd ask you all to cast your minds back only 3 years before the present-day catastrophe in Palestine erupted. The date is 24 February 2022. Russia invaded Ukraine for the second time in a decade, beginning its special military operation, as it called it, citing a purported responsibility to protect the Russian-speaking minority there. Moscow subsequently set up puppet governments in East Ukraine who would vote to secede from Kiev and form their own new states to be recognized by Russia. This followed the 2016 occupation and annexation by Russia of the Ukrainian territory in the Crimea, citing similar justifications. The response from the West was both swift and robust. All of it based on Russia's violation of 2 peremptory norms of international law, derogation from which, exceptions to which, are never permitted. First, the right of the people to self-determination of Ukraine, and second, the prohibition on territorial conquest. The general tenor in the West was captured well by Ingrid Brunk and Monica Hakami, both co-editors-in-chief of the American Journal of International Law, who wrote at the time that Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and I'm quoting here, will reshape the world that we all inhabit. There is no going back to the status quo ante. A war of territorial conquest with incalculable losses has again been initiated, and much will turn on how things unfold from here, end quote. In the Western rush to rightfully condemn Russia's criminal aggression against Ukraine, we were meant to believe that Moscow alone had placed the world at a crossroads of legal history, that Russia's actions portended something of a paradigm shift for international law and order. But for those familiar with international law and the question of Palestine, none of this was new. For the United Nations had literally wrote the proverbial book on the law prohibiting territorial conquest and supporting self-determination of peoples in the context of foreign military occupation of Palestine beginning in the 1960s. For us, to watch the Western elites wax lyrical about the violation of these principles in Ukraine was a vindication of sorts, until, of course, reality set in. For it wasn't very long after we attempted to use the Ukrainian precedent to highlight the plight of Palestinians that we were told by these same Western elites, whether in government, in universities, or in media, that while things in Palestine were unfortunate, the situation in Ukraine was somehow different. Palestine was complicated, we were told, while Ukraine was clear. The Palestinians were aggressors, we were told, while the Ukrainians were the victims of aggression. In any case, we were told Palestine was not a state, while Ukraine's statehood was never an issue. The implication being, of course, that the legal rights to sovereignty and independence of each of the Palestinian and Ukrainian peoples were somehow different, despite what the law and the facts had to say on the matter. In short, double standards were, yet again, the order of the day for Palestine. The very same legal principles that some Western powers purported to be driving their foreign policy agenda in occupied Ukraine were and continue to be blatantly violated by them elsewhere in the world, including in Palestine. As the late Edward Said once put it, and I'm quoting him, "If you wish to uphold basic human justice, you must do so for everyone, not just selectively for the people that your side, your culture, your nation designates as okay." The application of double standards in international law is a marked feature of the international legal order. In my own research on the United Nations and the question of Palestine, I've argued that double standards are partially to blame for the existence of a condition that I call international legal subalternity. The essence of this condition is that those who are subjected to it are continually presented with the promise of a more just and equitable future through the application of international law, bolstered by the unrivaled political legitimacy of the purveyor of that promise being the United Nations. And yet, despite the lengths to which such groups go in reliance on that promise, law's promise is perpetually kept out of reach in one form or another, and ironically through the very actions of the United Nations itself, which all too often either does not pay sufficient heed to the full array of what international law requires, or completely overlooks international law in practice. And yet, as I have also tried to argue in my research, and indeed in my practice, as was discussed earlier by Imseis, I still believe that there's much use in international law as a tool to push back. That for all of its ills, and there are many, international law contains the seeds of counter-hegemonic resistance. To my mind, the move by various Western states, including Spain, to recently recognize the state of Palestine is but the latest site where both legal subalternity has been reproduced, but also where the counter-hegemonic use of international law may be employed. This is particularly the case at the present moment, where the US and Israel are attempting to impose upon the Palestinians what will almost assuredly turn out to be a temporary ceasefire packaged as peace in an Orwellian sense, while Israel continues its onslaught against them in the weeks and months and perhaps years ahead. And we can talk about the Trump plan in question and answer, but you got a sense of where I'm going with it. For many, it will seem absurd that anyone should even discuss the recognition of the state of Palestine at this particular moment in time. For as I speak, the putative sovereign of that state, the Palestinian people, is facing its most serious existential threat ever. For the past 23 months, Israel has killed over 66,000 Palestinians and counting, 2/3 of whom women and children. Tens of thousands or more are presumed dead under the rubble. Over 1.9 million have been forcibly transferred That's almost 90% of the population of the Gaza Strip. And all of them have been subjected to an unrelenting and planned campaign of carpet bombing, scorched earth, and starvation as methods of war. In January 2024, the International Court of Justice determined that Israel is plausibly committing genocide against the Palestinians of Gaza. And both before and since then, numerous other UN-affiliated bodies, human rights organizations, hundreds of international law and genocide specialists the world over, all of them have concluded that not only is the Gaza genocide plausible, but that ominous threshold has long been passed. Against this apocalyptic backdrop, one could be forgiven for wondering why recognition of the state of Palestine even matters. For the multitude of those, like me, who always questioned the wisdom and legitimacy of the Oslo process, what Professor Said rightly called the Palestinian Versailles, any talk of recognizing the state of Palestine at this moment seems tone-deaf and performative at best, cynical at worst. For many, recognition of the state of Palestine by certain Western states has come too little, too late. As many of you know, some of the Western states now recognizing Palestine appear to have made their recognition subject to certain conditions or qualifications. I'm glad to say that Spain has not in its recognition. For instance, Canada's recognition is predicated on the so-called reform of the Palestinian Authority, the holding of general elections in 2026, ensuring that Hamas takes no part in those elections and plays no part in the future governance of Palestine, and that Palestine be a, quote, demilitarized state. Likewise, the United Kingdom, its recognition of the state of Palestine was given only because the Israeli government failed to take, and I'm quoting their Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, failed to take substantive steps to end the appalling situation in Gaza, agree to a ceasefire, and commit to a long-term sustainable peace, reviving the prospect of a two-state solution, end quote. The UK affirmed that Hamas must play no part in the government in Gaza. And finally, France has restated the Canadian position, but not as conditions as such, but rather as undertakings allegedly given by President of Palestine, Mahmoud Abbas. And in light of these commitments, the French have recognized the state of Palestine. Now, for any student of international relations, and I suspect there are a lot of you in this audience, the problems with these express or implied conditions should be self-evident. Otherwise, your professors are failing in their teaching of you. As an international lawyer, for me, they signify a continuation of the West's long-held reluctance, on full display today with the Trump plan, the West's long-held reluctance to take Palestine and Palestinians seriously, in accordance with the most basic principles of equality and morality. Leave aside logic. For instance, how can the Palestinian Authority engage in reform or even hold elections if Israel continues its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, including a ban on the use by that authority of its own tax revenues, or the holding of Palestinian elections in the city of Jerusalem? Does this not place Israel in a position of holding a veto power over the recognition of the putative state of Palestine by Canada and France? Likewise, upon what authority do these Western states assert a right to dictate to the Palestinian people who they may or may not vote for or be governed by? Is that not a choice solely for the Palestinian people, who each of these Western states have long recognized have a right to political self-determination? Likewise, in the face of an actual ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people, to say nothing of the decades-long apartheid regime that has given rise to it, by what legal, moral, or political authority do these Western states assert that the state of Palestine ought to be demilitarized? What of their so-called commitment to ensure that never again will such atrocity crimes be committed? And how is it possible, in the case of the United Kingdom in particular, that recognition can be held out as a punishment for Israel's failure to respect its own obligations under international law? This is particularly galling in view of the historical responsibility for the question of Palestine that the British themselves have. So if you, like me, are enraged by these apparent conditions or qualifications, the question arises, what can be done about it? In the realist world in which we live, recognition by these Western states is going ahead. Indeed, it's gone ahead. But what might we do to ensure that a principled course correction is adopted? Can international law be used to push back, counter-hegemonically? And what role does Spain, in particular, have to play in this regard? In my view, the answer to the questions that I've posed is yes, and Spain can do more and show more leadership. Given Spain's recognition of Palestine has not been qualified in a similar way to these other Western states, at least for now, fingers crossed. It is uniquely placed, well, we will bring that hope, won't we? Spain is uniquely placed to help push its Western allies in the right direction. In this regard, three fundamental principles of international law must be borne in mind when considering what recognition of Palestine statehood actually means. And these messages are not just for the Spanish government, but they're for civil society and students alike. Understand them well, and you will see where I'm going with it. First is the principle of non-intervention. This principle holds that no state may concern itself with the internal affairs of other states. This is nicely restated in Article 2, subsection 7 of the United Nations Charter. While the principle of non-intervention has been challenged in recent decades, most particularly with the notion of the so-called responsibility to protect, a responsibility, I should add, that has miraculously been forgotten by its Western authors when it has come to Gaza, there is no doubt that this principle prohibits foreign states from dictating how and by whom other peoples govern themselves. This is a principle that attaches to every state on earth, including Spain. In this respect, any suggestion by Canada, France, and the United Kingdom that recognition is subject to certain conditions being undertaken by the Palestinian people vis-a-vis how and by whom they govern themselves is a clear violation of international law and does not bind Palestine in any way on the international plane. It's not legal. It's illegal. And I should say the Canadians and the French and the UK know it. And it will drift by the wayside long after the state is recognized. Second is the principle of territorial integrity and political independence of states. This principle holds that the state, writ large, enjoys territorial sovereignty in a single territorial unit over which it exercises sovereignty to the exclusion of all other states. Political independence refers to the sovereignty exercised in the internal affairs of the state with respect to its institutions, its freedom of political decision, policy making, and in matters pertaining to its domestic and foreign affairs. This principle is nicely restated in Article 2, subsection 4 of the UN Charter. As should be readily apparent, the conditions or qualifications of the Western states now recognizing Palestine do not hold up against the principle of territorial integrity and political independence that inheres in the state that they're recognizing, being Palestine. Third is the principle of self-defense. Self-defense. This customary principle, codified in Article 51 of the UN Charter, holds that all states possess an inherent right to use force in self-defense if subjected to an armed attack, an unlawful armed attack, by another state. Such unlawful uses of force include illegal foreign military occupation and regimes of alien domination and subjugation and exploitation, such as that which Israel has imposed on the Palestinian people since at least 1967. Because each of these fundamental rules relate to or qualify, as international lawyers call them, jus cogens norms, or peremptory norms of general international law, derogation from which is not permitted under any circumstance, they impose binding legal obligations on all states to ensure their protection. So fundamental are these norms that all states are said to have an interest in ensuring their respect, ergo omnes, as against the whole of the international community. This means that to the extent that Spain's Western allies, now recognizing Palestine, including Australia, Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and others, have purported to impose conditions or qualifications on their recognition that violate or aid and assist Israel in the violation of these principles, those conditions have no legal validity whatsoever on the international plane. And it also means that recognition, and this is key, that recognition without sustained and serious sanctions imposed on Israel will render recognition merely symbolic. So there's a real threat of the symbolism of recognition coming to pass. It's up to us to ensure that does not take place. In light of all these things, owing to its relatively more principled approach to Palestine, Spain is in a unique position of global leadership to influence its allies in Canberra, Ottawa, Paris, and London, and beyond. And now is the time for principled foreign policies, including as driven by progressive legal and civil society action, as we see in Italy, for instance, with civil society and the union movement rising up, or on the university campuses globally, right? In this respect, two recent holdings of the International Court of Justice are of particular importance, including for all the Western states now recognizing Palestine, and including Spain. On 19 July 2024, in a case that derives in part from my own research, and in which I had the privilege to serve as legal counsel to the state of Palestine in, the International Court of Justice determined that Israel is not sovereign in the occupied Palestinian territory, and that its continued settlement of the territory, among other policies and practices, violates three peremptory norms of general international law. First, the prohibition on the acquisition of territory through force. Second, the obligation to respect the right of peoples to self-determination. Third, the obligation to refrain from imposing regimes of racial segregation and apartheid. Their words, not mine. The court and the obligation, the court accordingly determined that Israel's very presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, among these practices, its very presence in the territory is in and of itself unlawful, and that it is required to withdraw from the occupied territory unconditionally, and in the court's words, as rapidly as possible. The court further determined that all states, third states, including Spain, have an obligation to bring Israel's presence in the occupied territory to an end, not to recognize Israel's continued presence in the occupied territory as lawful, and, importantly, not to aid or assist Israel in the maintenance of its unlawful presence and actions in the occupied territory. This echoes the principle affirmed in the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2334 of 2016, that all states have an obligation to distinguish in their relationship with Israel between Israel on the one hand and the occupied Palestinian territory on the other. This is law. It's established. So in practical terms, this means that third states are under an obligation to completely alter their bilateral relationship with Israel. If Israel is unable to reasonably demonstrate that the subject matter of the relationship that it shares with third states has nothing to do with its continued illegal presence in the occupied territory, which is a very high threshold given the extent to which Israel has embedded itself in the territory and annexed it, if Israel is unable or unwilling to demonstrate this, the obligation to alter those relations extends not only to Israel in the occupied territory, but to Israel as a whole. This is particularly true of states like Western states now recognizing Palestine, who have close ties with Israel and who continue to trade or furnish it with political, military, economic, cultural, and other assistance and cooperation. The fact that recognition has been extended by some of these Western states to the state of Palestine has now added weight to the pressure that can be brought to bear on them to abide by their obligations not to aid or assist Israel in maintaining its illegal presence in Palestine. Additionally, third states, including Spain's allies, Australia, Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and so on, cannot continue to justify Israel's unlawful presence in the occupied territory with any arguments based on self-defense. As far back as 2004, the ICJ determined that Israel may not rely on Article 51 of the UN Charter, which codifies the right of states to use force in self-defense, to respond to attacks that emanate from within the occupied territory. Because Israel's presence in the occupied territory, including in the Gaza Strip, has now been determined by the court to be a violation of the UN Charter, Article 2, subsection 4, it qualifies as an unlawful aggression, much like Russia in Ukraine. And under international law, there is no self-defense justification for the crime of aggression. It just doesn't exist. It's oil and water. Quite the contrary, if any state enjoys a right to self-defense in this situation, it is the state of Palestine, not Israel. Because Palestine enjoys an inherent right of self-defense and is the subject of an ongoing 58-year illegal use of force against it, being the occupation, it can seek assistance from other states to help defend it from Israeli aggression, including those now recognizing it. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that under the present political climate, the Western states recognizing Palestine will send arms, material, and troops to Palestine if Palestine exercises its sovereign right to request such aid and assistance to defend itself from Israeli aggression, as the Ukrainians have done vis-a-vis Russia's aggression against them. But in principle, recognition of the state of Palestine opens the possibility for these arguments on self-defense of Palestinians to be made. And it's a perfect legal argument, flawless. And in this context, the legitimacy of the use of force, not only how force is used, international humanitarian law, but the legitimacy of the resort to force, is a particularly important matter. The fact that the Spanish government authorized sending a naval escort to support the Gaza Smooth Flotilla is a positive step in this direction. Certainly not enough, certainly not how it ended, but it's a positive step in that direction. It's an entry point for further action. Given the self-defense needs of the people of Palestine, much more would need to be done to protect its people from the aggression and the extermination that they're now facing. Another relevant ruling of the ICJ was its binding determination on 26 January 2024 in the case South Africa versus Israel, where the court held that Israel is plausibly engaged in a genocide in the occupied territory. This triggered the obligation of all states parties to the Genocide Convention, and indeed all states on earth, given the customary nature of the prohibition on genocide, to do everything reasonably within their power to prevent genocide. Of course, these obligations already bind the Western states who are now recognizing Palestine, including Spain. But by extending recognition, the scope of their obligations to do everything reasonably within their power to prevent genocide against the Palestinian people as a national group in their native land necessarily increases. The scope of what they're required to do increases. They must therefore do much more to adjust their relationship with Israel than merely recognize Palestine. I'm now talking of a full and complete boycott and divestment of the State of Israel, complete isolation of the apartheid genocidal regime. All of this to say, and in conclusion, in view of these cases and the erga omnes obligations they impose on third states, the recognition by Western states like Australia, France, Canada, the UK, Spain, and others has actually opened up a window of opportunity. As Spain's example has shown, recognition has increased avenues for pressure to be brought to bear on these Western states to alter their relationship with Israel. Now is precisely the time for all of us to press even harder for Western states that have recognized Palestine to impose full sanctions on Israel, diplomatic, economic, military, sporting, cultural, academic, and in other areas. Recognition has not in and of itself produced these legal obligations of third states vis-a-vis Israel, but there's no denying that recognition has increased the avenues of argument, both legal and political, that can help realize the change that is needed. They need to be exploited to the fullest, otherwise the justified fear that recognition will end up merely being symbolic may come to pass. Spain has a unique role to play in helping its Western allies adjust their policies towards this end. Thank you.
Bravo. You can have this just there. Perfect. Well, if it's okay with you, I think they can hear me. It's just for you. Oh no, he's got his microphone. Excellent. So let's open the room for questions. Let's open the floor. 3? Is it okay for you if we take 3?
De una en una.
One by one. First, here, please.
No, ya tiene. Ah, bueno, ¿lo tienes? ¿No tienes tú el micro? Vale, pues es ese que se ha quedado ahí. Gracias, Imseis.
Yes, hello, good afternoon. Thank you for such an inspiring and interesting intervention. I will focus my questions on the UN system. And first question, we all know, well, we all know, I wish, but lots of us know how Israel was first accepted as a member by the UN under a series of conditions regarding the population in the area that it never respected, first. Second, why recognizing at that time Israel and not Palestine?
Okay.
Third, sorry, and I have 2 more, it's very quick. Third, what happens today with all the baggage of international law regarding its implementation? I know that it's a question of the member states, but we see that despite the ICJ, etc., resolutions, absolutely nothing is implemented, is done. I don't remember the last one. Yes, probably it has to do with how can we expel Israel from the UN? Is that possible? And I leave it. Okay. I leave it there.
That's 4 questions in one.
Yes, sorry.
Am I audible? Can you hear me? You can all hear me? All right. So Israel's admission to the United Nations as a member state in May 1949 is a perfect case in point, demonstrating why recognition matters despite what appears to be merely symbolism. The Israelis gave representations. There are debates about how far those representations went. In my book, I pore over these. I looked at the record. I'm of the view they weren't as clear and unequivocal as some scholars, some Palestinian advocates in my sphere, believe they were. I think they were qualified. But let's take on the assumption that they gave these representations to respect their obligations under the UN Charter and UN General Assembly Resolution, in particular 194 of 11 December 1948, I think it was, to allow the Palestine refugees to return to their homes. They were admitted. Have they ever allowed them to return? Absolutely not. Has that fact impugned the statehood status and membership status as a state of the United Nations of Israel? Absolutely not. So I view this as the first of many examples to demonstrate the following principle. At international law, you are either a recognized state or you're not recognized. You can't be halfway recognized. You're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. But once recognition is given, it is never taken back. So whatever conditions have been imposed, extra legal conditions, things that are illegal, on the state of Palestine, to me, I'm not too concerned about that at all. The Israelis want the whole. They're actively engaged in destroying the Palestinian people as a national group in their homeland. We need the international community, including friends of Israel, to say, this far and no farther. We will never recognize your claims to sovereignty in foreign territory, being the state of Palestine. Only the Palestinian people are sovereign in that territory, to the exclusion of all others, regardless of what you do on the ground. Some of you will say, oh, that sounds good, Mr. Law. It's all principle. What about actual facts on the ground? This is a fact of life. The tension between law and discourse and normative force of principles and material facts on the ground. It's not unique to Palestine. It's a marked feature of the international order. But just because these things are in tension does not mean that both are not equally important. The Palestinian flag goes up at the United Nations, never coming down. It's already there as a non-member observer state. And you know you're doing the right thing when the Israeli government goes ballistic after recognitions come through. The job of civil society, the students of states, is to not stop at recognition. It must not be allowed to be merely symbolic. And international law principles that I've tried to set out today can help fill the gaps and make and give action. The last question was what we can do about Israel. Okay, membership in the United Nations is governed by Article 4 of the UN Charter. The long and the short of it is, I believe under Article 6, I could be mistaken, member states can be removed, their membership can be removed by a vote of the General Assembly as affirmed by the Security Council. So you need the Council on board. By virtue of the dynamic on the Council where the United States exercises a veto power, that will never happen. However, it is possible to remove Israel from the General Assembly of the United Nations, which is the plenary body of the organization, 193 member states, 2 non-member observer states being the Vatican, the Holy See, and Palestine. It is possible to remove them through something called the Credentials Committee, which sits in September every year before the General Assembly to come. That Credentials Committee, I believe, has 9 members on it, states members. And they vote every year to receive the credentials of the diplomats from every member state and situate them in the General Assembly. And as we know from the experience of the South African apartheid regime, the credentials of the apartheid regime of South Africa were withheld by the Credentials Committee, depriving South Africa to take its seat when it was an apartheid regime in the General Assembly as part of the larger boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that led to the end of apartheid. You can see where I'm going with it, friends. This is a prospect. I don't know when it will happen. But given Israel and its actions, what it's doing on the ground, Israel is its own worst enemy in this regard. Who knows where that will go? You asked a few other questions. I can't recall what they were. One was general on international law and enforcement.
Yeah.
Very quickly.
No, it's about enforcement of international law.
Yeah. All of you have this question, so I'll offer an answer to this. Is international law law? How can it be law if it's not enforced? Is it merely politics or policy disguised as law? That's certainly the way it looks like if you're Palestinian or on the outside of power looking in. Let me disabuse you of something. Please accept this like you would the Trinity for those of you who are good Catholics like my grandmother. Law is not self-executing. Law is not self-executing. States need to execute it. That means you need political will to execute law. Political will can be produced through legislation, through practice of states, through civil society putting pressure, through economy. There are ways to produce political will. And in the absence of the political will of international community of states to do the right thing, as we see in the Security Council, right? Just because the Council can't put a peacekeeping force on the ground by virtue of the US veto doesn't mean that states can't act outside of the Council. Doesn't indeed mean that states aren't obliged to do so individually. So you can act individually, domestically. You can have lawsuits domestically, for instance, to chase the fascists whenever they come here, right? As is being done increasingly. So that is to say, law, there are many ways to enforce international law. It doesn't operate the same way the domestic system does, with a centralized enforcement mechanism. It doesn't mean that law is no more or no less of a tool. It is very important. We just need to see creatively how it can be used, see how it's being used at the International Court of Justice now. Who would have ever thought that within the past 3 years, people would be speaking openly about the Jewish state, a state that emerged like a phoenix arising from the ashes of World War II and the Holocaust, a miracle state, that within living memory, this state would be in the dock at the principal judicial organ of the United Nations with allegations of genocide against it. None of that happens without men and women and people of conviction who decide to make it so. In this case, in South Africa, and with the help of others. I promise you that.
We believe you.
But the point, don't lose heart. It is possible to make a change. You just have to be creative and appreciate that law is not going to liberate. It's merely a tool, and there are many other tools in the toolbox.
Thank you very much, Mr. Imseis. You are a wonderful human being. Having said that, I had a question. If we look at USA, they have vetoed 6 times United Nations Security Council resolutions over Gaza in the last 2 years, but there was a United Nations Security Council resolution which was passed on 10th of June 2025, I think it was 2734, if my memory serves me right, and that resolution had a peace plan, the Biden peace plan with 3 points. If you look at the Trump's peace plan with 20 points, they are very similar. The first 5 points of Trump's plan are the first point of Biden's plan, and so forth. So, why, my first question, I'm like my friend Maya, I have 2 questions. My first question is, why, if we had a United Nations Security Council resolution on a peace plan, Israel didn't abide by it until, sorry, it was 10th of June 2024, didn't abide by it partially until January 2025, and then on the 18th of March 2025, they just collapsed it or didn't abide by it, and nothing happened to Israel? So that's my first question. And my second question, apart from my eternal idea of eradicating the veto right at the Security Council, but it's very difficult because the point where you go to reforming the United Nations need to abide by the 5 permanent members of Security Council, which is difficult. Apart from it, I only see another way of helping Palestine is civil society.
Yeah.
Upgoing with civil society. What's your opinion on that, sir?
Okay,
Thank
yes,
you very much.
absolutely. So
Quédatelo, ahora viene.
in terms of the peace plans, or that particular attempt to arrive at a ceasefire, there's no question that the Israelis didn't follow through. And the question is then, what now? They're protected by the United States. Like I say, that requires creative action to put pressure on the Israelis. Let's be honest about certain facts. The realist in me must do this. Israel is a regional hegemon in the region. It is protected by the global hegemon in the eastern Mediterranean Ocean and the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Gulf and across the region. What we have now, the dynamic on Israel-Palestine in the world, is it's basically 191 states against 2. There was an attempt by France and Saudi Arabia, worked on for a good number of years, to put together a series of principles in what became known as the New York Declaration, which was affirmed by the General Assembly just a few weeks ago. 142 states signed off on this, including Spain. And if you have a look at it, it's around a 3 or 4 page document. It's a series of principles about the implementation of the two-state framework, all of it based on international law, all of it based on what the International Court of Justice had affirmed in July 2024 that I affirmed earlier. This was an attempt by the French and the Saudis, supported by another 140 states, so basically an attempt by the majority of the world, to remove the so-called peace process from the hands of the United States. Because it's not an honest broker. Never has been and never will be. Trump and the Israelis realized they needed to outflank that effort of the French and the Saudis. Enter the Trump plan. You'll see now, increasingly over the next couple of weeks, and maybe even longer, the Trump plan touted, certainly by Mr. Trump, bless his heart, that this is peace in our time, or indeed over the course of 3 millennia, if you believe what he has to say. But it's false, obviously. And so the job of Spain and civil society, and I'll use this to get to your second question, is to pivot away from the nonsense of the Trump plan, notwithstanding the fact that it's a good thing that the guns have fallen silent for at least 24 or 48 hours, perhaps even 3 days, yeah? But the Israelis know what they want, and they're physically present in the territory, and they're open about it. They want the Palestinians out. They want all of the land. They want to settle that land. They're public and open about what they're doing. We must pivot back to a rules-based international legal framework like exists in the New York Declaration. It has some blemishes, to be sure. I agree, not with all of it. But at least pivot back to an international law-based approach. And this is why the Spanish position has been very good. They recognize without condition. And they do more than merely recognize. But they impose sanction. Is it enough? Certainly not. Is it an entry point? Absolutely. Does more of that need to be done? Yes. Look at Italy, going to your second question. Why do you think that the right-wing government of Italy, under Meloni of all governments, would send a frigate, a naval ship, to accompany the Freedom Flotilla, the Smooth Flotilla?
Because of the general strike.
Because of the general strike. So some people think to themselves, young people, I have no control over the world around me. Not so. The unions can organize. The academics have to organize and speak truth to power. People can organize and impose political costs on the political elites that run their governments and their countries, so that there are political costs that must be accommodated. Change can happen, slowly but surely. And this is what I'm talking about when I speak of the anti-apartheid movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. We are not passers-by in this world. We all have something to say, even at the dinner table. Talk to your parents, especially the young people. Tell them about what's happening. Move, huh? So civil society has a role to play. I say, but for civil society in Italy, none of that would have happened. Is it enough? No. That means we have to double down. The political elites are hoping that we sit on our hands and say, peace in our time. Not so. Certainly not if you're in Gaza.
Thank you very much.
Había una pregunta allá al fondo. Allí, el señor del fondo. No, allí al fondo. Allí.
There's a question at the back of the room. Oh, she already has the microphone.
There has been big protests by the side of Israelis against genocide, and why, if this is true?
Did I hear that correctly? Is it true that there's been protests against the genocide by Zionist Israelis?
By Israelis.
By Israelis? It's hard.
Israelis.
Right. Thank you. From what I see, there's a very small group of Israelis, what they call peaceniks, who are against what's happening in Gaza. And they hold protests from time to time. They're not very strong. They're not very representative of Israeli society, Israeli Jewish society, I should say. As a good example, when President Trump entered the Knesset today, the Israeli parliament, an Israeli Jewish parliamentarian, Ofer Kassif, yelled and got angry, and he tried to speak down on Trump, and he was duly removed from his spot in the Knesset. And he wasn't alone. There was another Palestinian Israeli member of parliament who was kicked out with him. So there is a small number of Israelis, very small, and sadly I should say, who protest against this, and sadly I should say they're so small that they're negligible. I'd say empirically speaking, from my experience, and based on what I see, there is no Israeli left-wing, Israeli Jewish Zionist left-wing party that is standing up and saying, no, not in my name. All of those protests that you saw in Tel Aviv, even before the 7th of October 2023, protesting Netanyahu and his abuse of law and his attempt to change the constitutional order and the powers of the Supreme Court. In the West, those events were pushed by liberal Zionists as evidence of Israel's vibrant democracy. A complete sham. Because after October the 7th, those same protests were held, including for the poor people who've been held captive in the Gaza Strip, Israelis, and by their families. They've been held religiously, but they're only about getting the captives free. They really don't care what happens to the Palestinians. They want them away. They want them done with. Don't believe me? Believe the polls of Israeli Jewish society. And the last poll that I recall some months ago was done by a University of Pennsylvania poll, which, and now I'm paraphrasing, so please don't quote me, but you can look it up online. The question was, are you supportive of what's happening in genocidal terms, of the erasure of the Palestinian people? And a majority of Israeli Jewish society said, yes, we want the war to continue. We do. So this is a bad thing. I can try and explain it to myself, and I'll try and explain it to you. I'm only one person. Israeli Jewish Zionist society is a society that is traumatized. For real reasons, but also for reasons, like all societies, based on myth. There's a historical trauma that is passed from generation to generation, especially from Ashkenazi Jews following World War II and the Holocaust. And there's a real sense of siege and besiegement that they have, that they are a victim people, the perennial victim, that they have an obligation to defend themselves from the barbarians at the gate, and that this time they will not fail the way they did in World War II, because they're powerful. They are what, in their words, they call the tough Jew, not the weak Jew. When you combine this sense of victimization, perennial victimization, with nuclear power and the highest ability to impress yourself on others in the region militarily. And then when you add religious Zionism, which posits that the Jews are chosen by God, right? If you're against us, you're against God, really. These three things produce a toxic result that makes it easy to dehumanize the other, the Palestinian indigenous people, who have been holding on for dear life, whose only crime is to have been in their land, in a land coveted by European Zionist settlers, and in a process of settler colonialism, of displacement of that population and replacement of it. So you could see where the logical culmination of the Zionist settler colonialism that has been undertaken for 100+ years in Palestine, fueled by this toxic connection, if you like, among Israeli Zionist Jews, sadly, and to a certain extent, understandably, has produced a genocide of the Palestinian people. There is a way out. Universality, humanity, international law, universal application of principles for all, regardless of who you are, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Palestinian, Israeli, between the river and the sea.
Ahora sí, cogemos la de señora.
Gracias.
We're really thankful to hear from someone like yourself. We feel really thankful having someone like you who are not in touch with the Muslim world or the Arab world defending the right of the Palestinians. As far as I understand it, the presence of Israel by force in the occupied territories, it's a precedent for Russia to occupy Ukraine, or it can be used as a precedent for the war in Ukraine. Do the two wars fuel one another, becoming stronger before international law? And maybe over time they will be allowed to stay where they are right now?
Thank you very much for the question. I should say, by virtue of the fact that for those who are Arabic speaking, my name is a funny name. It's not very common. بس بتحكي عربي أنا فلسطيني. أنا فلسطيني أنا. Yeah. So for those of you who speak Arabic, I'm a Palestinian. Yeah. So at any rate, there is a threat that the war in Ukraine and the war in Palestine, the aggression in Ukraine and the aggression committed against the Palestinian people, and wars elsewhere, to be sure, in Yemen, in South Sudan, in a number of other places that cry out in the ongoing conflict, post-conflict in Syria. I mean, there is a threat that this can become the order of the day. And all that I'm trying to say, dear friends, is that we must remain vigilant and do whatever we can to ensure that people who are on the receiving end of force, who are on the outside of power looking in, have their day, are listened to and taken seriously. This means universal application of norms. And if we're unable to do that, then it's only a matter of time before somebody knocks at our door here in the West and says, "Get out." Why? My God told me that this was my home. Right? So we're all part of the same global community, humanity. And to me, the world owes people, especially the Palestinian people, not because we're special. No. We're a relatively small people, a rural people, right? Small in number, diminutive in size territorially. But we stand at the front line and the vanguard of the international rules-based legal order. It's either never again now, or all is lost.
Había una en el medio. ¿Quién está? No. Bueno, se ha ido. Pues aquí delante. Aquí.
Thank you for your time, Ardi Imseis. I wanted to ask, in the line of previous questions, how feasible will be the application of Resolution 577 of the UN, mostly called Uniting for Peace, that certain leaders such as Gustavo Petro has called for the application itself, and in the lines of surpassing the overpower of the Security Council and really do real actions that really give international law its application. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. A great question. And for those of you who don't know, what was your name?
Esther.
Esther. Lovely. Lovely name. Esther's question speaks of the so-called Uniting for Peace resolution. So I should explain to you what this is and how it might be used, how it continues to be used in Palestine. Under the UN Charter, the UN Security Council has a principal responsibility for international peace and security. Where it cannot discharge its responsibility by virtue of blockage by a permanent member through the use of a veto, a secondary responsibility over international peace and security shifts to the General Assembly in what is called the Uniting for Peace process. It comes from the events of 1950 and the Korean War, when there was an attempt by the United States to get a peacekeeping force passed through the Security Council for what was happening on the Korean Peninsula, and it was blocked by the Soviet use of a veto. The US said, we don't need the Council. They created the Uniting for Peace process. The US did. They went to the General Assembly. The General Assembly passed resolution calling for the creation of a peacekeeping force, and indeed, a peacekeeping force was created, went to Korea. Ever since then, the Uniting for Peace formula, Resolution 577, has been used, and more so by Palestine than any other state. There is this false sense, a mistaken belief, filtering about now, that Palestine has yet to use the Uniting for Peace resolution during the course of the 23-month genocide. It's used it 5 times. Now, in the resolutions, and indeed, one such resolution, by the way, if you're interested in really looking at it in depth, it's the Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly, number 10, ES-10. And then there will be resolutions attached to that. So the resolution that produced the advisory opinion of July 2024 was ES Resolution 10, I think 2.3 maybe, 2.2. And then a resolution from the General Assembly that received it, imposing a deadline of 18 September 2025 on Israel to withdraw from the occupation, was ES 10/24, right? So the resolution is there. This resolution, when the General Assembly meets, it adjourns sine die in Latin. It adjourns without a return date. And whenever the General Assembly wants to bring it back on, it can. And it does. The question is whether or not it can be used to create a peacekeeping force, like the United States did in 1950. Now, Esther, you heard me talk about international law not being self-executing. States must have willpower to execute it. We know that Security Council resolutions are legally binding, whereas General Assembly resolutions are merely recommendations. So in the face of a Uniting for Peace resolution that may call for a peacekeeping force in Gaza, in the face of that, it would merely be a recommendation. So how would you think, I ask rhetorically, you could invest this resolution, if it were to be passed, with real teeth? You would need political will of the states who vote for it to vest any body that is created by it with human and material resources. Troops, money, guns. This doesn't exist. Political will. So you can have such a resolution. You can expend political will in the General Assembly to bring the international community together to pass such a resolution. But if the international community that votes for it doesn't actually vest the body that it creates with actual material resources, then there is no peacekeeping force. Think about it. In order to have a peacekeeping force, there must be political will, sufficient political will, to actually go to war with the IDF. And by extension, the United States 7th Fleet in the Eastern Mediterranean. Going to happen? That's why political will, in my view, is better spent on the BDS campaign. It's easier. It's local. It's decision-making in Madrid. It's local councils pressuring their elected representatives to stop doing business with the apartheid genocidal regime. It's in your hands, not in the hands of some military commander who doesn't want to go to war with the United States.
I have just a question about what can happen after, the day after of this Trump-Netanyahu plan. It seems that a legal obligation, which is reparation, will be put aside.
For now.
Please.
Okay. Basic law on what we call the law of responsibility. This will be intuitive to you. By show of hands, how many people do international law? Okay. It will be intuitive. When a state commits what we call an internationally wrongful act, when it violates an obligation that it has the obligation under the law of responsibility to do, in broad terms, three things. Cease the act. Obviously, stop violating the law, right? Second, give appropriate assurances of non-repetition of the act. And third, make appropriate reparation for any damage caused by the unlawful act. Reparations and the law of responsibility is secondary to the initial law, principal rules that are violated. First, you must assess whether or not there's a violation of law and legal obligation. Then you get to the reparations bit. There's no question in my mind that what the Israelis have been doing since 1947, November 29 of that year and on, is a continuing international legal series of continuing international legal acts, wrongful acts, for which reparations should flow. And what's happening now in Gaza is proof positive of that. What the international community is prepared to do to impose on Israel its obligation to make recompense, and reparations can mean anything from return of property, movable and immovable, return of refugees to the homes from which they were expelled and which may be destroyed. You can't bring dead people back, of course. So in a genocide situation, then you have compensation paid, as was done for the Jewish communities that suffered the Holocaust in World War II and others, right? All the way to an apology, what we call satisfaction, a public apology. In fact, there are lawyers in the United Kingdom now pressing the United Kingdom and in a case before the UK courts to seek an apology from the United Kingdom for the Balfour Declaration and everything that flowed from it afterwards. Merely an apology from His Majesty's government. So reparations is broad. In fact, he says reparations is not going to be looked at until such time as you have a resolution of the problem in line with international law. So reparations is part of accountability, but it doesn't happen before an assessment is made on the violations. There are many violations. Genocide has yet to be determined by the principal judicial organ of the UN. And when it does determine, if in my view it will determine, but when it does determine that it is a genocide, then there will have to be compensation commissions created to assess this. There is practice from World War II and the compensation commissions, mass claims processes that took place after the Holocaust, all the way up to the Iraq War. The UN Compensation Commission, UNCC. There's a whole body of practice on this. where the Iraqis had to pay for the violations of Kuwaiti rights and the rights of others affected by the invasion of Iraq, or rather of Kuwait by Iraq. So the law is there, but it will be secondary to resolving effectively the illegal occupation. Incidentally, on the illegal occupation, the International Court of Justice determined that when it determined that Israel's presence in the territory is unlawful, it also determined, as a result, that the legal consequences of that unlawful occupation, of that unlawful presence in the territory, require Israel to pay reparation to every natural and legal person affected by the occupation going back to 1967. Think about the enormity of that. Think about the enormity of what that means for 3 generations of Palestinians, and not just Palestinians. Every legal and natural person affected by the occupation. It could include Spanish companies, Spanish nationals who have children born there. It is very broad. Whole lives can be spent studying the extent of the reparations owed. Maybe the PhD students in here might want to devote themselves to that. But there are entry points for action.
Cogemos, bueno, había dos, venga.
2 last questions, please. You have the mic.
For your lecture has been very clear and insightful. I have a question, well, 2 questions, moving aside a little bit from state responsibility. And I would like to know your opinion regarding how international lawyers or civil society organizations can address double standards in international criminal law, specifically through universal jurisdiction where double standards and selectivity and unequal application of international law principles have also triggered legislative reforms in Belgium and even in Spain. Yeah. So how can we address this diplomacy of universal jurisdiction, and how would you say the ICJ arrest warrant ruling comes to play when prosecuting Israeli state officials eventually?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great question. So I'll answer your first question in the way that I offered the same position. Where there has been legislative reform to alter universal jurisdiction type laws in order to shield politically the embarrassment of the executive authorities in the country from state authorities, prosecuting attorneys and so on, putting Israelis in particular in the dock. Goes back to Belgium, like you mentioned, and the case against Ariel Sharon and so on. Political pressure needs to be brought to bear on the political elites who've changed the law. It's that simple. And that means civil society. That means young people, perhaps like you, running for office. It's a slow change. There's no promise of victory in the end. But as long as you know what your values are, based in international law, universal application of that law, regardless of who's in issue, then change can happen. So it's not a promising answer, but that's the only way to change the laws domestically to make them more universal and so on. I'm from Canada. I'll give you an example. We have a free trade agreement. This doesn't deal with criminal responsibility, but it can eventually. We have a free trade agreement with Israel that defines Israel territory as including the occupied Palestinian territory. For those international lawyers in the room, that makes this treaty void because it violates a peremptory norm of international law, the self-determination rights of the Palestinian people. Did the Canadian government know that it's void? Nope. Do they still trade with settlement products? Yep. Now that they've recognized Palestine, are there entry points for us to press the government to alter or change or suspend that agreement? Yes. Will action be taken by people who want to put this pressure on them? I should hope. The same is true with prosecuting those who are alleged to have committed war crimes, including those who might be Spanish nationals or Canadian nationals or French nationals who served in the Gaza Strip with the IDF. It's possible. So yes, change is possible. Legislative change is possible. Policy change is possible, but only from below if you push and do stuff like this. Talk, organize, act. The ICC arrest warrants help because now the ice is broken. The International Criminal Court was established in 2002. And I remember the days before its creation. I was then a young LLM student in New York at Columbia University. And we would have talks with the NGO who was supporting the creation of the ICC for many, many years. And I was particularly excited about the provisions of the Rome Statute that made it clear that settlement of an occupied territory by an occupying power qualified as a war crime and a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which was incorporated into the terms of the treaty. And so when I spoke to him, this guy who devoted his life to the creation of the court, and on the eve of the court's creation in 2002, about the prospect for Palestinians finally getting justice, his response, he was American. That should be the first case, he said. Let's wait for that. Why? It wouldn't be good politically, I was told. It took 20 years for a number of things to come about. The state of Palestine acceded to the Rome Statute. For those of you who are skeptical about the value of the state of Palestine's existence, know this: there would be no arrest warrants for the Prime Minister of Israel or the Defense Minister, the former Defense Minister, but for the juridical existence of the state of Palestine. That's reason enough to like the fact that the state of Palestine exists in law. Leave aside the problems on the ground, right? The fact that we have these arrest warrants out means that the ice is broken, means that jurists in other countries can say perfectly well and legitimately that these men are fugitives of international justice, and that as signatories to the Rome Statute, which I believe Spain is, we have an obligation to prosecute or extradite these people if they come into our jurisdiction. So it is a valuable thing. Although the prosecutor's office is going to slow roll this one, it's still valuable.
We'll take the last one. Cogemos la última pregunta que está.
Last question, please. One more. Okay. This is a little revolution going on here. Okay.
Hi, greetings from Colombia. Thank you for your time. I was going to ask you, what is your perspective on the role that governments in the so-called Global South should play in changing the rules of the game in such an hegemonic structure as the United Nations, and of course on the Palestinian question?
Thank you very much for the question, and it's good to hear a dear friend and colleague and sister from Colombia. I think the Global South, or what I like to call the global majority, right, is vital. It's vital. And we have the proof of it in the history of the United Nations. If the United Nations today was given the question of Palestine to determine whether or not to partition it, it would never pass, ever. It did pass in 1947 because the then General Assembly was dominated by the West. There was only 51 member states. The vast majority of them were Western, and the vast majority of the globe was still under imperialism. And it was through the decolonization of the Global South, the global majority, Latin America, Africa, and so on, that the face of the United Nations changed in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, where today, instead of 51 member states in the General Assembly, we have 193. Decolonization changed the priorities of the organization as a whole, and the priorities of the international community. And you see this reflected in international law. How many of you know the Friendly Relations Declaration of 1970? Or the great opinions of the International Court of Justice concerning Western Sahara, East Timor, Namibia, Southwest Africa. All of these things happened because Global South states chose to press in the United Nations system, we see that happening now with the Hague Group. We see that happening now with South Africa. We see that happening now with Nicaragua against Germany at the court, where the global South states, the global majority states say enough is enough. They have their political reasons. They do. They have their own domestic political reasons to want to do this. That's fine. Politics stops for no one, as I was telling Isaias earlier. We're all political animals. That's fine. I don't begrudge them for that. But they are looking at the global north, the minority of states. You can list them on two hands, right? The G7 plus God knows what, who are the hegemonic powers, who have most of the resources in the world, who have most of the military might in the world. The sun doesn't set on the United States empire, as they used to say of the British. So these states are saying, no, enough is enough. They play an extremely vital role, especially in the General Assembly. And but for these states, the Palestinian cause would have gone the way of the First Nations peoples in North America decades ago. Decades ago. And I document this in my book. The juridical existence of the people of Palestine is recognized by the General Assembly of the United Nations in the mid-1970s, but all the way building on the League of Nations period and everything beyond that. But since the mid-1970s, you have the slow recognition by the international community of Palestinian legal subjectivity, their peoplehood, their right to a state, the occupied territories as being occupied and therefore not the sovereign territory of Israel, by definition. All of this has culminated in what we have from the court in 2024. And now with the folly of the apartheid, aggressive, genocidal regime in Gaza over the past 23 months, it's continuing. You can see where it's going. And but for the global South, none of this would exist. Politics stops for no one. Rights matter, and so do international law. And the global South and majority see in Palestine an expression of their own history. And they have a fidelity to it. Nelson Mandela was right when he took the positions that he did. And if you sit down with the foreign minister of South Africa now, you have somebody who believes in what she's doing. Vehemently. They believe it. And so it's a good thing.
Vale, ahora sí cogemos esta última pregunta.
Last question now.
My name is Zahra from Palestine. I wanted to ask regarding the Global South, clearly in the case of Palestine, how it has been treated versus Russia by the UN and other global organizations. We have seen that the UN tends to be harsher on the Global South than in regards to Western states, and with the rise of organizations like BRICS and the African Union, do you think that the Global South will start looking at them as an alternative to the UN, or do you think there's still hope for change in the UN and for the UN to be more equal in their enforcement of laws?
Thank you, Zahra. Thank you. I don't think the United Nations is going to fundamentally change or alter its structure, certainly at the Security Council, easily or anytime soon. There are some proposals for that, including from the Global South and the BRICS countries, no doubt. Proposals like, for instance, there should be limitations on when veto power is used. Or, when veto power is used, states who use it should give full and fair reasons as to why they're using it. Or, the Security Council membership of permanent members should be expanded to BRICS countries, Brazil, South Africa, and so on. So that's happening, that discussion is happening, but it's theoretical because the only way, if you know law, the only way you can change the constitution of the organization, which is the UN Charter, is with the agreement of the permanent five powers, and they're just not going to do that easily. Does that mean that states from the global majority can't organize and make change on their own in regional blocks? Of course not. And we have the history to prove it. The Hague Group is one such example, but it's only the most recent example. There are disagreements among the Hague Group and how far they're willing to go politically. Who knows where that will go? But there are other blocks of states. The non-aligned movement, ASEAN, NATO, the Western group, the Western states and so on. So you can act, the Organization of American States, Organization of sort of African Union and so on. So you have these states. It's possible, but I don't think that we're at a stage now, despite my belief that Gaza is an inflection point in the international legal order, I don't think we're at a stage now where we're having a fundamental paradigm shift on the order of World War II, right? And the creation of the UN, or indeed on the order of World War I and the creation of the League of Nations. I don't think that's where we are. That's where we are now. One thing is for certain. We're at the end, in my view, of the great American century. This is the beginning of the end. Donald Trump has sort of ushered this in for us. But because the US has a tremendous authority, military capability, and economic capability, it won't go quickly. It will be ugly. But others are laying in wait. The Chinese, less so the Russians, India, Brazil, South Africa, a weaker Europe. If they got their act together, they could do something, but I don't think it will come easily. And we'll see where it's going. This is the beginning of the end of the great American century. And going back to Palestine, what we see today, I should end on this, is the beginning of the end of political Zionism. There's no question about that. There's no question about that. Yeah. It will come dirty and rough. And Palestinians will be on the receiving end. And the global majority will be on the receiving end of the American empire. But it will come.
Bueno, pues nos quedamos aquí con esa expectativa. Muchas gracias.
So we leave it here with that expectation. Thank you so much.
Sí, anuncio las siguientes porque bueno, esto nos daría tiempo para.
Well, this would give us time to continue talking for a very long time with Ardi. I would just like to invite you to the next conference that will be on Tuesday the 22nd. We'll talk about climate change in North Africa with Julia Zucker, who's a researcher at one of the international institutes, and we'll wait for you here on that Tuesday. Thank you very much.